In this video we're going to talk about ABC costing. However, let's start with the idea of activity-based management. Now this is defined by CIMA, the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants, in 2005. It's defined as actions based on activity-based cost analysis that aim to change the demand for activities so as to improve profitability. So it's looking at actions based on activity-based cost analysis. Activity-based cost analysis means that we're going to focus in on the activities of the business rather than simply looking to allocate overheads, for example, to different departments, or work on costs which are based on more traditional approaches. This is going to look at the idea of placing the costs against the activities of the business, at least doing so where possible. And this should lead to more precise pricing, because it's the activities of the business that's going to bear the costs, and it should lead to, hence, to better sales and to more profits, because the business is more accountable. Now the concept of ABC, activity-based costing, was first defined in the late 1980s by Kaplan and Burns. Initially, ABC focused on manufacturing industry, where technological developments and productivity improvements had reduced the proportion of direct labour and material costs, but had increased the proportion of indirect or overhead costs. As you'll appreciate, throughout the 1980s and 90s and right up to the present time, there has been increasing focus on the use of mechanization, robotics, labour-saving techniques, more advanced methods of production. So there was a shift away from people in favour of technology and machines. And this meant that it was necessary to find some ways of accounting for these extra overheads, these extra pieces of equipment, and to try and find a way of costing those out. The best way it was felt was to look at the activities of the business, look at the activities, if you like, of the technology, and to try to work out the costs based on what the technology was doing. Before this, when accountants looked at industry, they were able to, for example, cost labour inputs. They would know the labour bill, they would know the wage bill, and they would be able to calculate the number of output, the amount of output produced by a certain number of workers, and able to work out perhaps what the average worker was producing, and so on. But with the movement towards capital and the movement towards mechanization and the more sophisticated techniques of production that we experience now, that type of calculation is no longer appropriate, because labour is such a small proportion of the value of the total output. But nonetheless, those machines and that technology must be paid for. So looking at the activities of the business is felt to be more appropriate. Now let's look at the comparison of traditional costing and ABC, which overlaps with what I was just saying about the shift from labour into technology. While traditional methods of costing relied on the arbitrary addition of a proportion of the overheads onto direct costs to obtain total production costs. So the old way of doing it was to look at the overheads of the business, let's say the business rates, the business tax, which was applied to the whole business, and then allocate that to various departments. It could be allocated on the basis of floor space. take the total area of the business, because that's what pays, that's how the tax is calculated, let's say, and then work out the proportion of floor space occupied by the various departments, and then allocate the cost to the department based on floor space. It could be based on labour, the number of workers, or it could be based on some other measure. To some extent it's almost arbitrary, and that was one of the problems with the more traditional method of costing. But having said that, the overheads had to be apportioned in some way. They had to be accounted for, and they had to be built into the costs, so that the cost, the final cost, calculated cost of the output, reflected the true cost of the business. The traditional approach to cost allocation relies on the following steps. First of all, accumulated costs within a production or non-production department. So it's necessary to work out what are the accumulated costs within a given department. Clearly that's important. These must be covered. And allocate non-production costs within the firm to production departments. Now, non-production costs could be of the type I just mentioned. For example, business tax, which is just perhaps a tax on the building, a tax on the factory. Now that must be allocated. It's non-production. That tax has to be paid whether the business is producing or not. So it must be allocated to the various production departments. They must carry the burden of that tax. So non-production costs have to be allocated. There are other non-production costs as well. We could, for example, classify HRM, the Human Resource Management Department, as a type of non-production costs. Perhaps an argument could be made that they are production because they're improving the welfare of the workers and the skills and aptitudes of the workers. But it's a debatable point. Marketing could also be seen as non-production. But again, it depends on how we see marketing and what are the activities of the particular marketing department. But one thing for sure, the non-production costs must be covered. And in order for this to happen, they were apportioned to the production departments. Now, the traditional approach to cost allocation relies on 3 steps, as I said. Well, on several steps, but let's just work them out here. Let's imagine we have the company here. This rectangle is our company, and we have various departments, A, B, C, D. And these various departments work on the product in some way, and finally the product is produced and sold on to the market. Now, first of all, accumulate the costs of production or non-production department. So say Department A, calculate the total cost within the department. That could be the first thing we'd want to do. Find what happens within a given department, say Department A, find out what the total costs are within that department. Allocate non-production costs within the firm to production departments. Non-production costs could be the type I was talking about earlier, let's say business tax. And then allocate those within the company on some basis. As I said earlier, it could be on floor space, but it could be on different in different ways. It could be the number of workers within departments, and the costs are allocated according to the number of workers. So it's important to allocate non-production costs within the firm to production departments. So the non-production costs would then be allocated to departments A, B, C, D, and so on, so that each department is carrying the burden, part of the burden, for the non-production costs. Now the basis for allocation, as I said, could be floor space, it could be the wage bill, it could be some other basis. Depends on the business. And that, of course, makes it slightly arbitrary. There are problems then when we take one basis for allocation as opposed to another. We get different figures. Let's say we take labour costs, and the proportion of the labour costs are split up between the four departments A, B, C and D, and we see that the Department D carries 60%. Department C is 25, B is only 5% of the workers. Now the cost, let's say, of research and development, now that could be a cost that has to be paid for, the same way as business taxes would have to be paid for. The cost of research and development could be, say, £50,000 a year. Now how is that £50,000 paid for? How do the various departments contribute towards it? Well, if it's done on the basis of labour costs, then we take 50,000 times 10% for Department A, which gives us £5,000. The cost of HRM is, let's say, £90,000 for a year, just pretend, and therefore Department A would have to pay £9,000 to support HRM. So it could be done on the basis of labour cost, the percentage of the workers, let's say, within the various departments, and the cost of having those workers within those departments. That's one way of trying to allocate these non-production costs. Of course, as I said earlier, it could be done on the basis of floor space, in which case those percentages would change. Perhaps Department B doesn't have 5% of the floor space, perhaps it has 20% of the floor space, in which case Department B would bear a much bigger proportion of the, let's say, the cost of research and development and the cost of HRM. So it depends on the basis for the allocation. If it's labour costs, if it's floor space, how is it allocated exactly? So it is slightly arbitrary. Having done all of that and having recognized it, we go back and say allocate the resulting production department cost to the various products, services or customers. So we can go back to the individual departments where the costs have been allocated and now and try and allocate them further down to particular activities or particular products. So we're moving towards calculating the cost of the product. Now, activity-based costing, well, the traditional approach to cost accounting is this type of costing system usually allocates costs based on single volume measures, for example, floor space, labour costs, etc. So the non-production costs within the traditional method of cost allocation is normally a single measure. We take the floor space and we divide it up into the various departments and see which department has the most floor space, and they would carry the biggest burden, or which department has the greatest number of workers, and that department might carry the greatest burden. However, it is simplistic. It's not a very refined calculation, and as I said earlier, it does vary. If we take floor space, we'll get one set of figures. If we take labour costs, we might get a different set of figures. The percentages could be different. So it is simplistic. It seldom meets the cause and effect criteria desired in accurate cost accounting. Accurate cost accounting means trying to work out what are the costs actually for a product. What does it cost truly to make that product? Not this idea of simplistically allocating a proportion of the overheads and hoping that that covers the costs. because it doesn't give an accurate figure. The traditional method of costing, well, this method of costing has become increasingly inaccurate as the relative proportion of overhead costs has risen. As I said right at the start, there's been a shift from using labour to using machinery. And with the machinery, there will be more overheads, more space required for the machinery. The plant will have to be laid out differently, and there'll be a different design. So overheads has risen, direct labour has fallen as a proportion of output. This distortion of costs can result in inappropriate decision making. If companies continue to use traditional methods of costing when they're no longer appropriate, then of course that will lead to bad decision making, bad pricing, which can be disastrous for the business. Now with activity-based costing, we looking at an activity. Let's say the activity is running machinery. Now that's an activity. We're going to try to work out the costs based on the activities of the business. What does the business actually do? So we have to find out what's the cost driver, the activity cost driver. And the activity cost driver could be machine operating hours. So the activity is running the machine, but the cost driver is how long does the machine run for? Does it run all day, all night, or does it just run for an hour a day? Or how long does the machine run? That's the cost. Now, the machine drives the cost of labour, maintenance and power consumption. The machine may require workers to tender to the machine, to feed in the raw materials or to monitor its activities. But the machine will also have to be maintained, have to be serviced, and of course it will use power. So we're now looking at the business as having an activity. The activity is running machinery to make a certain product. The machinery has to run for a certain number of hours. That's the cost driver. And what it drives in terms of the detailed costs will be the cost of labour working with the machine, the maintenance of the machine and the power of the machine. So the overhead costs, well, the overhead costs go into if you like, a cost pool which have to be allocated. So the activity cost driver, well, material handling, procurement, machine setup, and others, for example HRM, marketing, maintenance and so on. So these are the activity cost drivers. Now what they drive are the material handling drives the cost per material movement, say from the stores into production, or semi-finished goods from production back into the stores and back out again. If a store is used, they may be using a different system of control. For example, using a just-in-time system where they're just moving items as and when required. But it depends. Say with procurement, it's the cost per purchase order. So that's what it drives. So the driver is leading on to the cost per purchase order. There must be a part of the business which deals with procurement, and what it drives is the cost per purchase order. The machine setup, well, someone must set the machine up, so it drives the cost of labour. And the others, well, it's the cost per unit input from each activity. And the activity itself, well, this is the product lines. This is what the company does. It makes certain products. So we've now broken up the product lines into see what's involved in these. We've worked out it's the labour, it's the cost per unit input for each activity, it's the cost per purchase order for procurement, and so we're moving back towards the overhead costs, and we've now found a way of linking the overhead costs to the product lines. So, in contrast to traditional cost accounting systems, the ABC systems first accumulate overheads for each organizational activity. So all the overheads are accumulated. They then assign the costs of these activities to products, services or customers, referred to as cost objects that cause that activity. So all of the overheads are accumulated and then they're assigned to, let's say, to particular products or to particular customers. The initial activity analysis is clearly the most difficult aspect of ABC. Activity analysis is the process of identifying appropriate output measures of activities and resources, the cost drivers, and their effect on the cost of making a product or providing a service. So it's important to be able to work out what the costs are, the accumulated costs are, and then trying to identify appropriate output measures of the activities and resources. It's important to identify the cost drivers, in other words, and then allocate the overheads to those cost drivers. ABC systems have the flexibility to provide special reports so that management can take decisions about the costs of designing, selling and delivering a product or service. So the ABC systems do give feedback to management, and the costs are allocated to activities rather than crudely allocated to departments. They're allocated to the activities straight away. ABC focuses on accumulating costs via activities, where traditional costs allocation focuses on accumulated costs within functional areas. And that really is one of the big differences. It's trying to find the costs of activities and then allocating the costs based on activities, whereas the traditional method of cost allocation looks at functional areas. It looks at the production department in total and works out what costs have to be borne by the production department. It looks at dispatch and what costs have to be borne by dispatch. And these costs could be, as I said earlier, could be research and development costs. Well, in a sense, the dispatch department hasn't got a lot of involvement with the research and development department, so why should it pay for any of it? So perhaps the research and development department, that activity should be based on some other activity of the business, say looking at an activity which will innovate the product, which means that it's the product itself that's carrying that cost, not allocated via a department, a functional area. The main advantage of ABC is that it minimizes or avoids distortions on product costs that might occur from arbitrary allocation of overhead costs. Well, as I said right at the start, allocating costs in the traditional manner could be based on floor space or the number of workers, on the wage bill, or on some means of allocating within functional areas. But it's simplistic. It's almost too simple, because it doesn't reflect the true costs that are borne by those departments. And it's arbitrary as well. If we take floor space as one basis of allocating it, we get one figure. If we take the number of workers, we get a different figure. If we take the wage bill, we might get a different figure again. So it is quite arbitrary. Steps in development of an ABC system. Well, ABC uses cost drivers to assign the costs of resources to activities, and unit costs as a way of measuring an output. So it uses cost drivers to assign the costs of resources to activities. So we need to know about cost drivers. And unit costs as a way of measuring an output. There are 4 steps in this. First of all, identifying activities. The organization needs to undertake an in-depth analysis of the operating processes of each responsibility center. Each process might consist of one or more activities required to produce an output. So we have a process, and the process is giving rise to an activity. So it's important to be able to work out the costs of that activity. Now, in working out the costs of the activity, we're working out the direct labor, the direct material inputs, the amount of energy and resources that are put in. But we also need to then work on the fact that the machine, let's say, has been used for a certain amount of time, and the depreciation on the machine for that period. And we need to look in detail at each activity and try to estimate as precisely as possible what does the activity cost, because that is an indicator of what the price will be and what the price charge will be, allowing for markup and profitability and so on. Assign resource costs to activity. This involves tracing costs to cost objects to determine why the cost occurred. So it's important to try and trace the costs through the system to see what gave rise to the costs and where were the costs, how were the costs dealt with, how were the costs allocated, and were they allocated in a reasonable fashion. For example, direct cost. Now these can be traced directly to one output. For example, the wood or the paint that goes to make a chair. Well, that's direct. So we know that there is a cost, the cost of the wood or the paint or the glue, and there is an activity, make a chair. So we can assign that cost to that activity straight away. Indirect, well, costs that cannot be allocated to an individual output. That is, they benefit 2 or more outputs, but not all outputs, for example. Just perhaps they benefit 2 particular activities, but not all activities. For example, maintenance costs for a certain piece of machinery. A certain piece of machinery may be used to make 2 items, just 2 items, or to engage in 2 processes. It doesn't engage in all the processes that are undertaken by the business, just perhaps undertaken, just used twice. Let's say it's undertaken to carry out two particular tasks. But how is the cost of that machine then apportioned between those two tasks? Is it the amount of time spent on each task? So there needs to be some clear allocation of the costs between the two tasks. General administration, well, the costs that cannot be associated with any product or service. Now, these costs are likely to remain unchanged, whatever the output is produced. For example, the salaries of admin staff and security costs or depreciation, these are going to happen anyway. But again, they have to be allocated. They have to be accounted for. So it's trying to find which activities are most responsible for those costs. Perhaps the admin staff, the administration staff, spend more of their time dealing with a certain type of product or a certain type of customer. Perhaps they deal with workers in a particular area more than others. It's difficult, however, to try to get an accurate allocation of these costs down to activities. And this is one of the big problems faced by activity-based costing. Identifying the outputs. Well, identify all the output for which an activity segment performs activities and consumes resources. The outputs might be products, services, or customers. So try to look at the outputs. What are the outputs of the activities? As I said, it could be products, it could be services. It could be services of an accounts firm, an accountancy firm who produces the accountants' services for businesses. Well, that's a service. It's not a tangible output. Or it could be, of course, the output is looking at customer satisfaction. Again, it's very difficult to try and allocate outputs because we have to know exactly what activities are assigned and how the costs are going to be compared between the activities and the outputs. And then assign activity costs to outputs. Now this is done using activity drivers. Activity drivers assigns activity costs to outputs, to the cost objects, based on the consumption or demand for activities. So the company engages in activities because the outputs are required by customers. So it's the outputs that will be sold by the business, and those outputs must reflect the costs of the business. Certainly they must reflect the costs of that particular activity, plus some markup, which will be a contribution towards the overall profitability and the overall costs of the business. So it could be done just by looking at particular product outputs, or it could be done by looking at particular customers who buy the product, and the costs could be assigned to that customer's account. The benefits of activity-based costing, well, it provides more accurate methods of costing of products and services. But as I said in the previous slides, it is difficult to calculate. It's not as straightforward as the more traditional method, but then again it is much more precise. It allows for better and more comprehensive understanding of overheads and what causes them to occur. It makes costly and non-value adding activities more visible. So allowing managers to focus on these areas to reduce or eliminate them. So it's very critical of all the activities of the business, asking what activities does the business engage in, what are the activities targeted at, where do they point, and if they're not contributing towards an output that can be sold, that there is a demand for the output, if they're not contributing to that, then are they essential, are they necessary activities? So it's looking at all non-value adding activities and questioning whether they should exist. It supports other management techniques such as continuous improvement, scorecards and performance management. So it runs alongside other activities that management may use in control of the business. But activity-based costing is one where the management focuses entirely on the activities of the business. If possible, they try to allocate all of the relevant costs to those various activities. They know exactly what this activity costs, the output from the activity, and therefore there's a very precise measurement of the costs of the business, and those costs are included in that activity. It also, as I said just a moment ago, enables the management to scrutinize other activities to see if they are necessary. So it's a way of looking at cost-saving measures within the business also. The drawbacks, well, ABC can be difficult and time-consuming to collect the data about activities and cost drivers. The traditional method is very simple to deal with. The business receives a charge, let's say in terms of some activity, perhaps research and development. That charge for research and development, the cost of research and development, is then allocated out to the various functional areas on the basis of some agreed basis. As I said, number of workers per department, or floor space, or whatever it is. So it's very simple to do. But with activity-based costing, it's trying to work out the costs of each activity. And it's tracing those activities through to the final output which goes to market. So it cuts across functional areas. It's the production of that output. And the different departments will be making a contribution towards the cost of that output. They will be adding to the costs of the output. But if the accountants can do it, they can then accumulate those costs and work out the final cost of the output based on the activities, based on the machines, the labour, all of the activities that have gone to make up that product. But it's not easily calculated. It can be costly to implement and to run and to manage an ABC system. It requires constant monitoring, constant scrutiny to make sure that only the activities that are incorporated in the product are costed. There might be other activities going on in the business which may be associated with other products, or even some activities that perhaps are enabling the business to function and improve its efficiency in the long run, perhaps training programs from the HRM department, for example. But it's important that the management understand the costs of each individual activity. That's the point. Even in ABC, some overhead costs are difficult to assign to products and customers, and these costs still have to be arbitrarily applied to products and customers. So despite everything we've said, there's still maybe parts of the business that management simply have to allocate the costs. They can't pin it down exactly to particular products. It may cut across the whole business. It could be a type of business tax, as I said earlier. So trying to work it out between activities may be very difficult. So there may be still room for management in all of this activity, for management to allocate costs to activities, simply to ensure that those costs are covered and that the different activities are making a contribution towards those particular costs. But it could be a quite arbitrary decision. So what we've seen here is a very complex system, to some extent, of cost accountancy. It's not an easy one to develop. It does require a lot of patience and a lot of involvement and scrutiny to ensure that it's up to date and appropriate. There's the issue at the end is still relevant. There's still some arbitrary decision making, but it's still felt that trying to work out costs based on activities, how much does a particular activity cost, is more appropriate than simply allocating overheads in the traditional manner to various functional areas and hoping that everything is going to be correct on that basis. So it does enable management to work out what the cost of activities are and get more precise pricing as a consequence. So there are big advantages in activity-based costing, but the disadvantages in terms of the effort involved in doing it needs to be borne in mind. Well, that's all we're going to deal with in this session, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.